"Dad, don't come home tonight if you still want to live." Eli whispered behind me, his voice shaking so badly that I had to slam on the brakes and pull over to the side of the road. I laughed out of reflex, a stupid laugh from someone who didn't yet understand what was happening. But when the boy looked straight at me and continued, "I heard Mom say the dose was enough already," my heart felt like it was being crushed, and in that exact moment, I did not turn the car around and go home. I turned off the headlights and drove straight into an empty dirt lot across from my house, the place where I was about to see something no father should ever have to witness. If you're still listening, tell me where you're hearing this story from. What country or city? Don't forget to hit like so this story can reach more people, because what's coming next might send chills down your spine. My name is Calvin Monroe, 69 years old, an American man who's lived long enough to know that in this life, some things don't need to be shouted to leave you frozen in place. I fixed cars for nearly 40 years at a small garage off a Georgia highway. These hands have gripped the steering wheels of thousands of vehicles, changed oil, tuned engines, wiped sweat away with sleeves soaked in the smell of metal. I thought I understood people well enough. But that night, in just a few short minutes, I realized there are truths you can never prepare for. That afternoon had started out completely normal. I drove Lorraine to the airport, just like every other time she said she had a business trip. She wore a beige coat, her hair neatly pinned up, the familiar perfume I'd smelled for years. She kissed my cheek lightly at the terminal entrance, reminded me to take my medicine on time, then wheeled her suitcase straight inside. I stood there watching until she disappeared into the crowd. No lingering embrace, nothing that raised suspicion. We'd been together long enough for trips like that to feel routine. On the drive home, Eli sat in the back seat, unusually quiet. Normally, he talked non-stop about school, new toys, the baseball team he loved. But that day, halfway home, he hadn't said a single word. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror and saw his small hands gripping the seatbelt tightly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You tired?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Eli didn't answer. He just nodded slightly. But there was something in that nod that unsettled me. It wasn't the sleepiness of a child. It was the fear of someone trying to hide something far too big for his age. As soon as the car turned onto the road leading to our neighborhood, Eli suddenly spoke. He didn't turn his head. He didn't look at me, just a sentence forced out of him. Then came the whisper that made me slam on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I pulled over, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I turned around and looked at him. His eyes weren't the eyes of a child lying. They were the eyes of a child who had been dragged into the adult world far too early. I opened the car door and took Eli into a nearby gas station. I needed time. I needed a closed space where I could hear every word clearly. Inside the cramped restroom, under harsh fluorescent lights, Eli told me everything in broken phrases. He said that a few days earlier, while he was taking a shower, he heard his mom talking on the phone in the bedroom. The door was partly open. He hadn't meant to listen, but words like "last night," "enough dose," and "not much longer" scared him so badly that he stood frozen under the cold water. I leaned against the wall, feeling like someone had sucked all the air out of my lungs. My mind began connecting things I'd brushed off before. The unexplained dizziness, the constant fatigue despite getting enough sleep, the strange metallic taste in my mouth every morning. I'd told myself it was age, the price of a lifetime of manual labor. I never imagined someone was helping me grow weaker day by day. I didn't call the police, not because I don't believe in the law, but because there are situations where one wrong move leaves you with no chance to fix it. I needed certainty. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes, even if it destroyed whatever life I had left. I brought Eli back to the car. Night had fallen. Streetlights flicked on one by one, like cold eyes staring down. Instead of turning into the familiar road home, I drove past it, circled around, and took the narrow road behind the neighborhood. An empty dirt lot sat across from my house, abandoned for years. I parked there, turned off the engine, killed the lights, and pulled Eli close. I held him tight, feeling his heart pounding through his thin shirt. We sat in the darkness, separated from my house by just a narrow road. That house, the place I'd once believed was the safest spot in the world. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message lit up the screen. Landed safely. Don't forget your medicine. Lorraine. I stared at the words for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply. I looked up just as the front door of my house opened. The lights inside came on. And then I saw her. Lorraine stepped out. No suitcase, no airport coat. She wore a dress I'd never seen her wear on any business trip. And beside her was Victor. Victor Brooks, my son-in-law, the man I once believed was a good husband to my daughter, the man I'd invited to dinner every holiday, raised a glass for when he got promoted. He stood very close to Lorraine, too close for any misunderstanding. I held my breath. Eli squeezed my hand until it hurt. I couldn't look away. Lorraine turned, said something to Victor. He laughed, a laugh I'd never heard him use around me. Then he leaned down. They kissed, not hurried, not secretive, like they'd done it 100 times before. Victor pulled a key from his pocket. Not a spare. The main key. He unlocked my house effortlessly, like it had been his for years. The door closed behind them. The lights stayed on. I sat motionless in the car, my mind completely blank. One thing was crystal clear in that moment. Not anger, not the pain of betrayal, but a numb, icy realization. They thought I was inside the house. They thought I was lying in bed, growing weaker, taking the medicine Lorraine brought every night. They thought I was slowly dying, without ever understanding what was happening. I looked down at Eli. He looked back at me, his eyes red but resolute. In that moment, I understood this night wasn't just about seeing the truth. It was the night I had to choose, either let everything end in silence or keep living, in a completely different way. I kept my eyes on my house, not because I hoped things would somehow change, but because there are moments in life when looking away too soon means lying to yourself forever. Lights spilled from the living room windows. I'd installed those lights myself, chosen the warm glow because I thought it made the house feel safer. Now that same light only made everything inside clearer, like a stage where I was forced to watch my own life as an unwilling spectator. Lorraine and Victor moved around my office, the room I'd always considered my most private space. I watched them pull open drawers, spread documents across the desk, flip through folders. Papers I'd guarded for years were now handled without hesitation. Victor sat in my chair, the leather chair I'd kept since retirement, and slowly spun it, as if testing what it felt like to own the place. I could hear their voices through the small microphone Miles had helped me install years earlier, back when I thought it was just neighborhood security. Now it was the only ear I had inside my own home. "Where's the insurance paperwork?" Victor asked, his voice stripped of the politeness he used around me. Lorraine answered sharply as she pulled a folder from the bottom drawer. "Right here, I told you. Everything's ready." Victor flipped through a few pages, his lips curling upward. Then he placed something on the desk. The sound of metal hitting wood came through the speaker, dry, unmistakable. I stopped breathing. It was a gun, not something hidden hastily. He set it right in the center of the desk, casually, like a set of keys. Victor leaned back in the chair, looked at Lorraine, and lowered his voice. "If the medicine doesn't do the job." The sentence didn't need finishing. It hung in the air, heavy enough to crush my chest. Eli shuddered in my arms. I pulled him closer, my old hand pressing against his back, trying to keep both our breathing steady. In that moment, every last doubt vanished. This wasn't just marital betrayal. It wasn't greed or an affair. This was murder. Cold, calculated, planned. I knew that if I stayed there any longer, if I listened any more, I might lose control. Anger surged inside me, but another part of me, the part that had lived long enough to understand the cost of impulsive decisions, spoke louder. I couldn't confront them now, not with Eli there, not while they believed I was weak, dying, that everything was under their control. My only advantage was that very misconception. I quietly opened the car door and whispered to Eli that we were leaving. Not going home. Not tonight. He didn't ask questions, just nodded. Somewhere deep down, he knew that place was no longer safe. I started the engine and drove away from the dirt lot without turning on the headlights for the first few hundred yards. When the road opened up, I switched them on and accelerated, no destination in mind. Just putting distance between us and that house as fast as possible. The night stretched ahead of me, the highway empty, road signs reflecting cold white light. Eli drifted asleep in the back seat, his head against the window. I watched him in the rear-view mirror, my chest heavy. I'd believed I could protect him by giving him a stable home. I was wrong. As I drove through the darkness, memories flooded back uncontrollably. I thought about the years after my first wife died. I had money, not flashy rich, but enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. Still, I chose simplicity. I fixed cars, wore old clothes, drove a beat-up pickup. I wanted to know who would stay for me, not for the numbers in my accounts. That was when Lorraine entered my life. She was gentle, attentive, never asked how much I made. When I told her I was just a retired mechanic, she smiled and said that was enough. I believed her. I believed living modestly would buy sincerity. I never imagined I'd be paying with my life. The car crossed the city limits. Houses thinned out. Streetlights became scarce. I pulled into a roadside rest stop, carried Eli out, bought him a bottle of water and some snacks. I needed him awake, needed him to know I was still in control, even though I was feeling my way through the dark myself. After Eli finished eating and got back into the car, I decided to leave the highway. A road leading downtown appeared. I knew where I was going, even if I hadn't said it out loud. There are places you never think you'll return to, until you need them most. The hotel towered over the block, its exterior lights blazing, glass doors reflecting luxury cars coming and going. I hadn't stepped inside in over 10 years. Back then, I'd been a different man in the eyes of the world. I parked at the entrance and looked at Eli. "Stay here. I'll be right back." He grabbed my hand, squeezed gently. I nodded and forced a smile. Inside the lobby, the contrast hit me immediately. Cool air, a faint scent of perfume, leather shoes echoing on polished stone. The receptionist looked up, her eyes flicking over my plain clothes before settling into professional courtesy. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" I didn't answer right away. I reached into my jacket pocket. In that moment, I felt my heart beat clearly, not from fear, but because I knew one small action would change how the world saw me from here on out. I placed a black card on the counter. No numbers, no name, just a smooth surface reflecting the lights above. The receptionist's expression changed instantly. Not just polite now, recognition. Understanding that the man standing before her wasn't someone who'd wandered into a place he didn't belong. "Welcome back, Mr. Monroe," she said, lowering her voice slightly. I didn't reply. I just stood there, fully aware that from this moment on, I was no longer the man Lorraine and Victor believed they were slowly killing in that house. She led me through a side corridor where the carpet was thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. Everything looked the same as I remembered. Only I was different. 10 years ago, I'd walked into this hotel as a familiar name, recognized without introductions. Then I'd closed that door myself, choosing a quieter life. I thought I'd never need it again. Life has a way of dragging you back to places you once ran from. Eli was taken up to a room first, carefully watched. I told him to sleep, that things would be better in the morning. I wasn't sure how much I believed that, but I needed him to. When the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a long moment, took a deep breath, then pulled out my phone. There was a number I hadn't called in years, not out of anger or estrangement, but because I wanted the past to stay in the past. Right now, I couldn't afford that pride. The phone rang twice. "Calvin?" The voice answered, low and familiar. "You've been gone a long time." "Sam," I said, "I need to see you, right now." A brief pause. Then, without questions, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Dr. Samuel Wright was always like that. He was the only person who had seen both sides of my life, the simple mechanic and the man behind contracts Lorraine never knew about. He'd been my personal physician, then my friend. When I stepped away, he respected it and never pushed. He arrived faster than I expected. Same tall, lean frame, same dark coat, sharp eyes, but not cold. When he saw me, he hesitated, like he was assessing a patient he hadn't seen in years. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," he said bluntly. "I think that's why I called you." Inside the room, I told Sam everything. I didn't leave out a single detail. The dizziness, the metallic taste, Eli's words in the car, the gun on my desk. Sam didn't interrupt. He just listened, nodding slightly now and then. When I finished, he stood up and pulled a small kit from his bag. "I need to check a few things," he said. The results came quicker than I wanted. Sam looked at me, not surprised, just serious. "You've been poisoned over time," he said. "Low doses, regular, enough to weaken you without drawing attention." I didn't ask what it was. I just nodded. "Through milk?" I asked, as if confirming what I already knew. Sam studied me. "You drink milk every night?" "Lorraine always brings it upstairs," I said. "Says it's good for my bones." He let out a slow breath. "Completely possible. Dissolves easily. No smell, no taste. A little every night. It doesn't kill right away, but it's enough to make you look like you're just aging on your own." There was something very strange about hearing someone talk so calmly about the fact that you were being slowly killed. No panic, no drama, just raw truth laid out on the table, like the gun I had seen in my office. Sam placed a hand on my shoulder. "You came in just in time. You're still alive. But if this had gone on for a few more weeks—" He didn't finish the sentence. I looked down at my hands. Hands that had once tightened bolts, lifted entire truck engines, now trembling slightly as I clenched them. I thought about the nights Lorraine stood by my bed, handing me a glass of milk with that gentle smile. I thought about how I drank it without a second thought. "I need your help," I said, my voice so steady it surprised even me. But not in the usual way. Sam frowned. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to die," I said. "On paper." He stared at me, eyes widening for a moment, then lowered his voice. "What are you talking about, Calvin?" "I'm going to die," I repeated slowly. "Not for real, but enough for them to believe it, enough for them to show their true faces." Sam was silent for a long time. I could see him wrestling with it in his head. Finally, he sat down, his hands clasped together. "Do you understand how dangerous this is?" "I do," I said, "but it's the only way to protect Eli, and to let the truth expose itself." He looked at me like he was staring at the most stubborn patient of his life. Then he gave a slight nod. "If we do this, we do it all the way." When Sam left to prepare what was needed, I pulled out my phone and called another number. Miles Carter, private investigator, the man who had helped me deal with problems money alone couldn't solve. Miles answered immediately. "Haven't heard your voice in a long time." "I need you," I said. "Right now." "Same old methods?" "Worse," I replied. "And more dangerous." A soft laugh came through the line. "Now that sounds interesting." We met that same night. Miles listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger lightly on the table. "They think you're weak," he said. "That's your biggest advantage." "I want eyes and ears everywhere," I replied. "In my house, every corner." Miles nodded. "Cameras, mics, the kind they'll never find." "And when the time comes," I continued, "I want them to believe no one can save me." He looked at me, his gaze sharpening. "You sure about this?" I thought of Eli, of the fear in his eyes in the car. "I am." The plan began to take shape, each piece locking into place with cold precision. I would return home as a frail, barely functional old man. I would let them continue, let them grow confident, let them say and do the things they normally kept hidden. But there was one thing I needed to make clear to Miles. I looked him straight in the eye. "When it starts," I said, "don't stop them." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Don't intervene too early," I emphasized. "I need them to believe no one is in control anymore." Miles didn't answer right away. Then he exhaled. "You're putting yourself in real danger." "I know," I said, "but if I don't, they'll never fully expose themselves." He nodded slowly. "All right, but I'll stay close. Very close." When everything was set, I sat alone in the quiet hotel room. Outside the window, the city was still lit up, still loud, as if nothing had changed. I looked at my reflection in the glass. An old man with gray hair, slightly hunched shoulders, tired eyes. The perfect image of someone about to die in the eyes of those who wanted him dead. I closed my eyes and thought about the next morning, about the glass of milk, about the house, and I knew that when I stepped back into it, I would no longer be the man they thought they were slowly killing. I would be a shadow they didn't recognize, until it was too late. I returned home the next morning, exactly as planned. No ambulance, no commotion, just a tired old man being helped into the bedroom by his wife. Lorraine played the devoted caregiver so convincingly that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed it myself. She helped me lie down, pulled the blanket up to my chest, placed a glass of water beside me, and reminded me to take my medicine on time. In her eyes, I had taken one more step closer to the death they were waiting for. What they didn't know was that the moment the bedroom door closed, my first move had already been activated. I didn't do anything directly, just a short phone call, a few carefully prepared sentences. The joint accounts in my name and Lorraine's, household accounts, secondary credit cards, family spending funds were quietly frozen one by one. No notifications, no warnings. They simply stopped working. I chose that method because it mirrored exactly what they had been doing to me for weeks. Slow, silent, without letting the other side realize right away. In the quiet bedroom, I lay there with my eyes half closed, listening to every sound in the house. I heard Victor's footsteps when he arrived, the scrape of a chair, soft laughter, the refrigerator opening. They went on living just as they believed, thinking I was nearly dead, that everything was already in their hands. Miles's cameras began sending images to the device hidden under my pillow. I didn't look right away. I waited until everything moved at the right pace. That afternoon, Lorraine and Victor left the house. She told me they were going out to buy a few necessities. Her voice was gentle, her hands resting on my shoulders like a false promise. When the door closed behind them, I opened my eyes. No fatigue, no shaking. Only the cold clarity of someone watching a trap from the inside. They went to the largest shopping mall in the area. I recognized it instantly when the car camera feed came through. A place of luxury, bright lights, stores filled with expensive things I'd never bought for myself. Victor walked ahead, Lorraine beside him, her arm linked through his as if they had long been a legitimate couple. No hesitation at all. They entered a clothing store first. Victor picked out jackets, a watch, leather shoes. Lorraine tried on handbags. I saw that familiar smile of hers in the mirror, the smile I once believed was meant for me. The sales associate bowed slightly, polite and patient. At the checkout counter, Victor pulled out a card in my name. I knew what would happen next. Still, when it actually did, I felt something strange inside me. Not joy, not pain, just confirmation. The card reader beeped once. The clerk looked down at the screen, then tried again. Once, then twice. Her face tightened. "I'm sorry, sir. Your card has been declined." Victor frowned. "Run it again." She did. This time the message was clearer. Transaction declined. The atmosphere shifted. People nearby turned their heads. Lorraine kept her smile, but I could see her hand tightening on the bag strap. Victor snapped, loud enough for a few people to hear. "Must be a system error." The clerk shook her head, her voice dropping. "The system shows the account has been temporarily frozen." I watched Victor's face flush red. He pulled out his phone and called my number. It rang in my jacket pocket. I let it ring. Again and again. Lorraine turned to look at him, uncertainty creeping into her eyes. The confidence of someone about to win was gone. Victor turned back to the counter, his voice no longer polite. "That old bastard is playing games." The words echoed through the store. A few people looked over more closely. The sales associate froze, unsure how to respond. Lorraine grabbed Victor's arm and whispered something, but I could clearly see it, the first real panic on her face. Not fear of being exposed, fear of losing money. They left the store in heavy silence. No arms linked, no laughter. The camera followed them to the parking garage. The moment the car doors slammed shut, Victor slammed his fist into the steering wheel. I couldn't hear everything, but I could read the curses on his lips. Lorraine tried to say something, her voice higher than usual. They argued, not explosively, but enough for me to know the calm between them was cracking. They didn't return to the mall. They went home. I closed my eyes when I heard the car pull into the driveway. I let my body return to the weak state they expected. When Victor entered the bedroom, he looked at me with undisguised contempt. No greeting, no concern, just a glance, like looking at something about to be thrown away. They started searching. Drawers, the safe, filing cabinets. I heard papers being pulled out, tossed onto the desk, metal clanking together. Victor lost patience quickly. He slammed cabinet doors, cursed. Lorraine flipped through folders, trying to stay calm, but her breathing was already uneven. "Why is there no cash?" she snapped. Victor kicked the edge of the table. "He hid it. He always pretended to be broke." He stormed into the living room. I heard furniture shoved, a picture frame crashing to the floor. A photo of me and Eli shattered. I didn't open my eyes, but I knew exactly which one it was. I remembered where I'd hung it. Victor came back into the bedroom. He stood right beside my bed, leaned down, staring at my face. "Useless walking corpse," he said quietly, full of hate. "Can't even die properly." Lorraine didn't stop him. She stood behind him in silence. That silence was more frightening than the insults. I watched everything through the small screen, memorizing every movement, every word. I didn't interfere. Not yet. As they left the bedroom, I heard Victor say something, soft enough for them to think I couldn't hear, but clear enough for the camera to catch. "If there's no money, then we need to clear the path for the kid." The words sent ice down my spine. I remained still, eyes closed, breathing slow, but in my mind, everything had changed. I knew that from that moment on, this was no longer a psychological game or a simple unmasking plan. This was a race against time. And Eli, my son, was the final line I would never allow anyone to cross. I didn't sleep that night, not out of fear, but because every sense in me was stretched too tight to relax. Victor's words repeated in my head, cold and blunt, like a sentence already signed. I understood perfectly. If I hesitated, if I delayed, Eli would become their next piece on the board. And so the fake death plan, something I once thought existed only in stories I'd heard somewhere, began to move forward, step by step, with a precision that allowed no mistakes. I left the house on a gray afternoon, saying I needed to go to the hospital for a checkup because I felt dizzy. Lorraine played the worried wife perfectly. She helped me to the car, reminding me again and again to bring my medicine. I nodded weakly, letting her believe everything was still under her control. Victor didn't come along. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed, watching the car pull away as if waiting for good news. The car didn't take me straight to the hospital. It turned onto another road where Miles was already waiting. Everything happened quickly but calmly. I switched to a different vehicle, put on clothes that had been prepared in advance. Minutes later, the first car, the one with my license plate, was pushed down a deserted stretch of road on the outskirts where there were no houses for miles. When I heard the explosion in the distance, my chest tightened slightly. Not with regret, but with the knowledge that from that moment on, the old version of me was officially dead in their eyes. Images of the burning car spread faster than I expected. Local media didn't miss the opportunity. An elderly man in a serious accident, a vehicle engulfed in flames, survival uncertain. Those familiar phrases quickly appeared on the television screen hanging in the sealed room where I was lying. I watched them with a strange detachment, like I was seeing someone else's story, not my own. I was taken into the hospital in critical condition. Not through the usual emergency entrance, but through a private route Sam had arranged. I lay on the gurney, eyes closed, letting doctors and nurses move around me. Ceiling lights slid past overhead, cold and steady. The familiar smell of antiseptic. I had been on stretchers like this many times in my life, but never with my mind this awake. Lorraine appeared not long after. I heard her footsteps before I opened my eyes. Carefully measured sobs. Not too loud, not too soft. When I looked, I saw her standing there, hands trembling over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Anyone who didn't know the truth would have thought she was shattered. She grabbed my hand, squeezed it tightly, called my name in a choked voice. I let my hand go limp, unresponsive. I felt a very subtle, very hidden satisfaction in the way she checked for any reaction. When she thought no one was watching, her eyes quickly returned to normal, cold and calculating. The doctors spoke at length about injuries, about critical condition, about low chances of recovery. Lorraine nodded nonstop, wiped her tears, thanked everyone. She played the role so perfectly that even I had to admit it. If I didn't know who she really was, I would have believed her. When the room was finally empty except for the two of us, Lorraine leaned closer. I felt her breath by my ear, smelled the familiar perfume, and then, very softly, very slowly, she whispered, "Just die already. It'll be easier that way." Those 4 words carried no anger, no resentment, just a cold suggestion, like talking about turning off a light or closing a door. In that moment, I felt no pain, only absolute clarity. The woman standing before me was no longer the Lorraine I had loved or trusted. She was simply someone waiting for the final outcome of a long-term plan. I didn't move, didn't open my eyes, didn't change my breathing. I let her believe those words had fallen into the unconscious void of a dying man. Not long after, Sam came in with another group of doctors. He delivered the diagnosis we had agreed on beforehand. Locked-in syndrome. Alive. Fully aware, but unable to move or communicate. A perfect shell for a man trapped inside his own body. Lorraine collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Victor arrived later, his face tense at first, then gradually relaxing as the explanation continued. I didn't need to look to know he sighed in relief. A small breath, but enough for me to recognize the comfort of someone who had just avoided trouble. He stood close to my bed, looking down. "So that's it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "He can't do anything anymore." They started talking about the future right there in my hospital room, as if I didn't exist. About selling the house, about what was left in the accounts, about how much it would cost to take care of me. I heard everything, every single word, memorizing every voice, every way they said my name like I was a burden. In the end, Lorraine suggested taking me home. "It'll be more familiar there," she told the doctor. "I'll take care of him." Sam looked at me, very quickly, very discreetly, a glance just long enough for me to know he understood this was the most dangerous phase. But he nodded, as agreed. If that's what the family wants. As they wheeled me out of the hospital room, I looked up at the ceiling one last time. The white lights slid past overhead, exactly like when I was brought in. Only one thing was different. This time, I knew exactly where I was going. When the wheelchair stopped at the front door of the house, I felt the familiar air of what had once been my home. Lorraine bent down to straighten my blanket, her gentle smile returning. Victor stood behind her, hands in his pockets, his eyes cold. I understood very clearly that the moment those wheels crossed the threshold, I was entering the darkest part of the plan. Everything I'd just lived through had only been the opening act. Real hell was just beginning. They pushed me into the house the way you push in a piece of furniture you've just bought and haven't decided where to put yet. No greeting, no hesitation. The door closed behind us, that familiar sound heavier than ever. The house that had once been my home, where every corner bore the marks of my own hands, now felt completely different. Cold, empty, and full of looks that saw me as an obstacle to be dealt with. The bed they put me on was set up in the living room, right under the staircase. Lorraine said it was more convenient for care. But I understood the real reason. They wanted me somewhere easy to watch, easy to control, and easy to forget. Daylight streamed straight onto my face through the large window. At night, the lights were never fully turned off. Everything was exposed, including the helplessness they believed I carried. For the first few days, Lorraine still kept up a thin layer of pretense. She brought water, adjusted my pillow, spoke to me in a soft voice. But the moment no one else was around, that smile vanished frighteningly fast. My food was reduced little by little, from thin soup to warm water, from warm water to just a few sips, enough to keep me from dying right away. The medication changed too. I could smell something strange in the new pills, a different taste. Sam had warned me to be extremely careful. I pretended to swallow them, let them dissolve at the corner of my lips, then discreetly spit them into a towel when no one was looking. Lorraine noticed I was getting weaker, and it pleased her. She no longer bothered playing the kind wife. Her voice grew sharp, her eyes openly annoyed whenever she had to touch me. Sometimes she stood in front of me, arms crossed, looking at me like an unfinished task. "You're such a hassle," she said without lowering her voice. "If only this would hurry up." Victor never bothered pretending from the start. He treated me like a piece of furniture. When he walked past, he shoved my chair aside to clear the way. Once, he kicked the bed frame hard because it was in his way. The dull crack echoed through the room, making me flinch inside, but I wasn't allowed to react. He bent down close to my face, squinting as if searching for signs of life. Finding none, he scoffed and walked away. I lay there with my eyes half closed, my ears more alert than they'd ever been. Every footstep, every spoon hitting a bowl, every door opening became information. Miles's cameras quietly recorded everything. I knew every angle, every blind spot. I knew I was being watched, not to be rescued, but to be documented. And I accepted that, because I needed evidence more than I needed comfort. By midweek, they stopped holding back. I heard their laughter at night, loud music, the clink of glasses. They lived in my house as if I were already dead. And then, one night, something I never thought I'd have to witness happened. They didn't bother closing the curtains. They didn't lower their voices. Victor pulled Lorraine down onto the sofa right in front of me. She laughed, sharp and high, nothing like the voice that once whispered beside my bed. They talked about me the way you talk about a broken object. "Look at him," Victor said mockingly. "A vegetable husband." Lorraine laughed louder, as if it were a joke. I didn't look, but I saw. Not with my eyes, but with every other sense. The sounds, the movement, the air in the room. I kept my breathing steady, my body still. In my mind, every second passed painfully slow. Not because of jealousy, not because of shame, but because of the cruelty of being stripped even of the right to turn away. When it was over, Victor stood up, pulled on his shirt, and turned toward me. He stepped very close, leaned down. I smelled the strong reek of alcohol on his breath. Then he spit in my face. "Let's see if you react," he said, his voice full of provocation. The spit slid down my cheek, cold and sticky. I stayed still. No movement, no grimace, no opening my eyes. In that moment, I heard Lorraine let out a small laugh, a satisfied one. The cameras recorded everything, every word, every gesture, every moment they thought no one could see. I reminded myself to hold on to that, to keep it steady, because if I let my emotions break through now, everything would collapse. In the days that followed, they started talking about Eli more often. At first, it sounded harmless. "Where's the kid? Why hasn't he been back?" Then the tone shifted. Victor talked about cleaning up loose ends. Lorraine talked about making things tidy. I heard them discussing it at night when they thought I was deep in unconsciousness. "The kid knows too much," Victor said. "Can't let him hang around." Lorraine was silent for a moment, then replied in an icy voice, "There's a way." Each word felt like a knife. But I couldn't react. I had to listen. I had to remember. I had to let the cameras do their job. This was the reason I chose this path, to make them say everything themselves. The breaking point came one morning. Lorraine stood beside me, adjusting the blanket with quick, decisive movements. She turned to Victor and spoke like she was scheduling an ordinary appointment. "Tomorrow, call Child Protective Services." The words landed lightly, but inside me they rang like an alarm bell. I knew exactly what that meant. Eli would be taken away, separated from me, placed in the hands of people I didn't know, while the two standing in front of me tried to erase every trace. I lay there, unmoving, eyes closed, but in my mind, something crossed a line. This was no longer just about me. It was about my son. And the moment Lorraine said that, I knew the time for silence was almost over. After Lorraine's cold statement, the house fell into a strange stillness. Not the calm kind, but a tense quiet, like the surface of water before a storm. I lay there, motionless, but every sense wide open. I knew I didn't have much time left. And I also knew that if there was one person in this world who could crack the shell they'd wrapped around me, it could only be Eli. The boy began to suspect I was still conscious one late afternoon, when sunlight slanted through the living room window, casting long shadows on the ceiling. Lorraine and Victor were out. I heard the door close, the car start, then silence. Eli stood at the edge of the living room for a long time, neither fully entering nor walking away. I could feel the hesitation in his breathing. "Dad." His voice was small and shaking, like he was afraid of the sound itself. "Can you hear me?" I didn't move, not because I didn't want to, but because I had to be sure. Sure, no one was watching. Miles's cameras showed that only the two of us were in the house, but the habit of playing dead had sunk into every muscle. I stayed still, eyes barely closed. Eli took a step closer, then another. He stood right beside me, close enough that I could hear his quick breaths. "I know you're not asleep," he said softly. "I saw you move the other day." My heart pounded. One beat, then another. I couldn't miss this moment, but I couldn't speak, couldn't open my eyes, couldn't do anything obvious. I could only give him a sign, something only we would understand. I moved my pinky finger ever so slightly, just a tiny twitch, almost impossible to notice if you weren't watching closely. Eli sucked in a deep breath. I heard a sob being swallowed back. He didn't cry out loud. He raised a hand to cover his mouth, as if afraid that letting the emotion out would shatter everything. Then he leaned down close to my ear. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew you were still here." From that moment on, we were no longer isolated victims. We became a team, just two people, and one of them unable to speak. Eli was far smarter than his age, probably because he'd been forced to grow up too fast. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't demand proof. He only needed to know I was alive, listening, thinking. And so he began talking to me when he was certain no adults were nearby. He told me about school, about being sent home early because of family matters. He told me about the fear he felt every time Victor entered the room, about the way Lorraine looked at him like he was an inconvenience. Each sentence was another piece, helping me see the full picture they were painting behind my back. I answered him with the smallest movements I could manage. A slight twitch of my wrist for yes, a gentle curl of a finger for no. We set our own code, no words needed. Eli learned fast, so fast it filled me with both pride and pain. The boy started sneaking me food. Not full meals, just small spoonfuls of juice, tiny pieces of soft bread. He did it clumsily but carefully. Once he spilled some water onto the towel and panicked, almost crying. I moved my finger slightly to say it was okay. He smiled through his tears. Eli was the one keeping me alive in those days. Not medicine, not the plan, but the quiet patience and love of a child who refused to let his father disappear. One evening, as light rain fell outside, Eli sat beside me longer than usual. He didn't tell a story. He just looked at me for a long time. Then he said, his voice steady, no longer trembling, "I don't need money. I need my dad." Those words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I'd been thinking about money too much in those days, as a tool, as a shield. My son reminded me of what truly mattered. Not how much I could take back, but who I could protect. Eli started doing something I never asked him to do. He took his old phone, hid it under his pillow, and turned on the recorder whenever Lorraine and Victor spoke loudly. He secretly filmed them when they argued, when they planned. He didn't fully understand everything they said, but he understood that it mattered, that it was evidence, that it was truth. He whispered to me whenever he captured something. "I've got this," he said. "I hid it. They don't know." In that small voice was a determination that made me shudder. No child should have to do these things. But Eli did, for me. From then on, he wasn't just my son. He became my only ally in that house, the only one who believed I wasn't just a breathing corpse, the only one who treated me like a human being. And because of that, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I lay there, listening to the rain on the porch, Victor laughing in the kitchen, Lorraine talking on the phone in her fake voice. I let the sounds wash over me like waves. But in my mind, a decision had been made. It was time to strike back, not with rage, not with haste, but with everything they had unknowingly handed me, their overconfidence, their unmasked cruelty, and their belief that I was completely powerless. I moved my finger once more, signaling Eli. He understood. He gave a small nod, his eyes bright in the dark. We didn't say another word. We didn't need to. We both knew the silence we'd maintained for so long was about to end. And when it did, nothing in this house would ever be the same again. Victor began losing control in a way even Lorraine could no longer hide. His outbursts no longer came and went. They lingered, soaked in alcohol and frustration. The money was frozen. The plan was delayed. And most importantly, he felt his power in this house was no longer as complete as he'd believed. I lay there, unmoving, but heard everything. Every heavy footstep, every piece of furniture shoved aside, every ragged breath of a man burning himself alive in anger. Naomi came home one rainy afternoon. She didn't call ahead. Maybe she sensed something was wrong. I heard the door open, wet shoes on the wooden floor, then my daughter's soft call. "Dad?" Her voice shook, but she tried to stay calm. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell her I was still here. But I had to remain still. Not yet. Victor appeared from the kitchen, a bottle still in his hand. He looked at Naomi with undisguised irritation. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. "I came to see Dad," Naomi replied, trying to step toward me. Lorraine stood on the stairs, arms crossed, silent. Her eyes flicked from me to Naomi, cold and measuring. I knew that in their minds, Naomi was a variable, something they hadn't accounted for. Victor blocked Naomi's path. "Your dad doesn't need visitors," he said. "He doesn't know anything anymore." Naomi didn't back down. She'd always been like her mother that way, refusing to yield when something was wrong. "You don't get to say that," she shot back. "This is my father's house." That sentence was like a spark to a full gasoline can. Victor threw the bottle to the floor. Glass shattered loudly. He stepped forward, then another step. Naomi didn't have time to react before the slap landed. The sharp crack echoed through the room, sending a shock through me from the inside out. I heard Naomi's sharp inhale, her feet stumbling back into the table. Eli was standing in the hallway. I knew because the camera showed he'd run out when he heard the crash. He stood frozen, hands shaking, eyes wide as he watched his brother-in-law strike his sister. "Stop!" Eli screamed, his voice breaking with fear. Victor spun around. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a drunk man. It was the look of someone who had crossed the final line. He stepped toward Eli, raising his hand. "Get back in your room!" he roared. In that moment, everything inside me exploded. No more plan, no more waiting, no more silence. I had endured enough. I had heard enough. I had seen enough. And most of all, my son was in danger. I sprang out of bed. Pain shot through my body as muscles were forced into motion after days of stillness. But the pain was nothing compared to the fury driving me upright. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the room, clear and heavy with a strength I hadn't realized I still had. "Take your hand off my son." The room froze. Victor stood rigid, his arm still raised. Naomi turned, eyes wide. Lorraine screamed and stumbled back a step, like she'd seen a ghost. Eli whipped around to look at me, tears spilling over, but mixed with a relief so intense it hurt. Victor stammered, You can stand?" I didn't answer. I took another step forward. Victor backed up instinctively, but the alcohol and panic threw him off balance. When he swung at me, everything happened fast. Maybe it was because I'd been a mechanic. Maybe years of manual labor had trained my reflexes. I stepped aside, grabbed his wrist, and twisted hard. The sound of bone breaking was sharp and unmistakable. Victor screamed, a high, short scream filled with pain. He collapsed, clutching his twisted arm. Naomi stumbled back, gasping. Lorraine began to cry, but not the fake crying she'd perfected. This was real panic. She shook her head over and over, muttering nonsense. "That's impossible. That's impossible." The front door burst open. Miles walked in, swift and decisive. I had signaled him earlier, waiting for this exact moment. He locked the door, secured it from the inside, then turned to take in the scene without surprise. He'd seen everything on camera. "No one's going anywhere," Miles said, his voice calm but firm. Victor lay on the floor, groaning. Lorraine lunged for the door, but Miles was already blocking it. Naomi stood close to Eli, her arm wrapped tightly around him. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, but my mind clearer than it had ever been. "This house," I said, my voice dropping low, "has no place for the two of you anymore." Lorraine looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm your wife." "No," I replied. "You're the one who put drugs in my milk, the one who waited for me to die. You stopped being my wife a long time ago." Victor lifted his head, hatred and fear tangled in his eyes. "You'll pay for this," he growled weakly. I looked down at him, no anger left, only resolve. "No," I said. "You already have." Miles stepped forward and set his phone on the table. "Everything's been recorded," he said. "Every word, every action." Lorraine collapsed into a chair, clutching her head. Naomi moved closer to me, trembling. "Dad," she said, tears spilling over. I put my hand on her shoulder, feeling life, truth, and my own return. I turned to Victor and Lorraine, my voice not loud, but every word clear. "Leave my house, right now." "You can't," Lorraine started. "I can," I cut in, "and I will." Miles opened the back door and gestured. Victor tried to stand but couldn't. Miles called for medical assistance, not out of mercy, but because everything had to be handled the right way. Lorraine looked around as if searching for another way out, but there wasn't one. She walked out the door, her shoulders shaking without looking back. When the door closed behind them, the house fell silent. A silence completely different from before. No longer heavy, no longer frightening. I turned to Eli and knelt down to his level. He threw his arms around me, sobbing. I held my son, felt the small rhythm of his heart, and knew that even though there was still so much to do, even though everything wasn't over, this moment, the moment the dead man stood up, had changed everything. I had been silent for too long, and from now on, no one would ever dare see me as a breathing corpse in my own home again. The evening of the charity gala came faster than I expected. Just a few days after Victor was taken to the hospital with his arm in a cast and Lorraine fled the house in a state of panic, the city slipped back into its familiar rhythm. Brief news segments skimmed over the family incident and moved on to other stories. To most people, I was just an older man who had been through a crisis. To Lorraine and Victor, though, they needed to quickly restore their image, reclaim their place in the world they still believed belonged to them. This year's charity gala was held at a large hotel right in the city center. I'd been invited many times before, but it had been a long while since I'd shown up. Lorraine was different. She still had her connections, still knew how to smile for the cameras, still felt at home on a stage telling stories that moved people. Victor, too. He loved being seen, being pitied, being patted on the shoulder in sympathy. They appeared together as if nothing had ever happened. Lorraine wore a dark, modest dress, her makeup light, her eyes slightly red as if she'd been crying. Victor stood beside her, his casted arm hanging in a sling, his expression weary but resilient. A perfect couple to anyone who only saw the surface. I watched it all on a small screen in my office. Miles stood beside me in silence. Naomi and Eli had been taken somewhere safe. I didn't want them witnessing this part. This was mine. Lorraine stepped onto the stage when the host invited her to say a few words. The lights came up, highlighting her face. I used to think I knew every line of it. Now all I saw was a carefully worn mask. She began telling her story about an elderly, sick husband, about months of tireless care, about sudden betrayal, about being thrown out of the house in the middle of the night. Her voice trembled at the right moments, paused at just the right places. Sympathetic nods rippled through the audience. A few murmurs followed. Victor was mentioned as a good man, dragged into an unwanted tragedy. I didn't feel angry. I felt a cold familiarity. This was how they always operated, bending the truth until it fit their hands. Victor was invited up to speak. He held the microphone with his free hand, his voice hoarse with emotion. He talked about being misunderstood, about the pain of being seen as the villain, about his broken arm as a symbol of all he'd endured. He didn't forget to mention me, calling me the father I once respected. That was when I stood up. No one noticed at first. I walked out from the back of the hall, unhurried, unannounced. I wore a simple suit, nothing flashy. As I moved closer, a few heads turned. A small murmur spread, then grew quickly. Some people recognized me. Others looked confused, like they'd just seen a ghost. Lorraine saw me first. Her eyes froze for a split second. The microphone in her hand trembled slightly. Victor turned instinctively, then went rigid, his face drained of color. Not from the lights, but from the truth standing right in front of him. I stepped onto the stage before the host could react. I gave him a small nod as if asking permission. I didn't need to say much. Being there was enough. "I won't speak for long," I said into the microphone. My voice was calm, not raised, but clear enough for the entire room. "I think you should hear for yourselves." Miles gave the signal. The large screen behind the stage lit up. Not with video at first, but with an audio recording, beginning with sounds I knew all too well. Chairs scraping, papers rustling. Victor's voice rang out, unmistakable. The plan, the drugs, the timing, words recorded in my own office, words he never believed would see the light of day. The room went dead silent. Then came Lorraine's voice, calm, calculated, talking about the final night, about everything being ready, no fake tears, no grieving wife act, just bare truth. Halfway through, when the line, "If the drugs don't do the job," played, someone in the audience sucked in a sharp breath. I saw a woman cover her mouth. A man bowed his head and shook it slowly. Lorraine stood frozen. Victor stumbled back a step, nearly losing his balance. Their faces were ghostly pale, as if all the blood had drained away. No one needed to add anything. The story they'd told minutes earlier collapsed right there on that stage. The media reacted instantly. Camera flashes exploded across the room. Lenses swung toward me, toward Lorraine, toward Victor. Questions started flying, but I didn't answer. I stood there and let the recording continue. There was no dramatic staging, no fiery accusations, just the truth, layer by layer, laid bare for everyone to see. When the recording ended, I turned off the microphone. I didn't need to say anything else. I looked once across the room, then at Lorraine and Victor. There was no anger in my eyes, only finality. I walked off the stage as murmurs surged like waves. Some people called my name. Some called the police. Some rushed after Lorraine as she staggered away. Victor stood still, as if his feet were glued to the floor. Their reputations collapsed in the very evening they thought would earn them sympathy. No courtroom needed yet. No accusations from me. Just the truth. And enough light. When I left the hall, Miles walked beside me and rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. I didn't speak. I didn't feel relieved, and I didn't feel weighed down. I just felt that a chapter had closed. Outside, the night air was cool. I took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing upright in this world, not as a victim, not as an avenger, just a man who had decided to let the truth speak for itself, and it had done its job. The consequences came faster than I expected, but not in the loud, dramatic way movies like to show. There were no handcuffs clanking in the middle of the gala, no victor being dragged away in front of hundreds of cameras. Everything happened slower, quieter, and because of that, far heavier. Victor was arrested 2 days later. I didn't hear it from the news, but from a short call with Miles. His voice was steady, as if confirming an appointment. The charges were longer than I'd imagined. Conspiracy to poison, domestic abuse, threats against a minor, property damage, and financial fraud I'd never even noticed. Each charge peeled back another layer, exposing the man he truly was to the people he thought he could fool. Victor didn't resist. According to Miles, when the police read the warrant, he just sat there, face ashen, his casted arm resting on his thigh. No more aggression, no more defiance, just a man who finally understood the game was over. Lorraine was different. She believed she'd gotten away. I knew because the very night Victor was arrested, my phone started buzzing. Calls from a familiar number, then from unknown ones. Messages piled up. At first, it was fake concern. "Are you okay?" "I just want to talk." Then came the begging. "I need you. You're the only one who understands me." And finally, blame and anger. "You ruined my life." I didn't reply to a single message. I didn't answer a single call. Not because I was afraid to face her, but because I understood something very clearly. If I spoke, even once, she'd cling to it like a final life raft, and I was no longer responsible for keeping her afloat. Lorraine began showing up in places I never expected. Outside my gate, in the parking lot of a law office, even near the cafe where I used to sit in the mornings. But each time, I wasn't there. Not by accident. I'd changed my routines, learned how to take detours, how to turn down different streets, not to run away, but to cut ties. By midweek, Lorraine's tone shifted completely. No more pleading, no more accusations, just raw panic. Her messages grew shorter, more fragmented. "Do you know what they're doing? I have nothing left. They're looking for me." I didn't need to ask who they were. I knew. The viral moment came on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in my office, the window cracked open, late sunlight washing over the bare wall. Naomi called me, her voice tight. "Dad, turn on the news." I switched on the TV just as the broadcast cut to a short report. They didn't mention my name. They didn't need to. On the screen was Lorraine, standing outside an office building, her face pale, hair disheveled, none of her usual careful makeup. A man in a gray suit stood across from her, holding a stack of papers. The anchor's voice was even, but each word landed like a nail. "Creditors have begun to appear, demanding repayment of loans taken out in the name of Lorraine Monroe, totaling several $1,000,000. The camera zoomed in. I saw the moment Lorraine realized she was being filmed. She turned to leave but was stopped. The man in the gray suit said something, held out the documents. I couldn't hear the details, but I knew what they were. Loans she'd taken out, believing they'd be paid off with my assets after I passed. Signatures I'd never seen, yet perfectly legal on paper. Lorraine shook her head frantically. She said something, maybe denial, maybe pleading. But her face said it all. This was no longer a game she could control. This was the consequence of choices she'd believed she'd never have to face. After that report, Lorraine disappeared. Not suddenly, like in a movie, but gradually, from familiar places. She stopped showing up outside my house. The calls stopped. The messages stopped. I heard from Miles that she'd moved several times in a single week, changed phone numbers, avoided the media. But debts can't be avoided. People she once laughed with no longer answered her calls. Doors that once opened because of her reputation now slammed shut. Meanwhile, my life slowly shifted onto a different track. Not completely peaceful, but clearer. I spent more time with Naomi and Eli. I took my son to school every morning, picked him up every afternoon. I sat in parent meetings I'd once skipped. I learned how to live again as someone with time, not someone counting down. One afternoon, I was asked a question I knew was coming. My lawyer sat across from me and placed a folder on the desk. "Do you want to intervene?" he asked. "Given what's happening, your statement or involvement could end this much faster for her." I stared at the folder for a long time. Inside was Lorraine's name, the numbers, the legal consequences she was facing. I thought about the evenings she'd brought me milk, about the whisper by my hospital bed, about the cold look when she spoke of Eli. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was growing dark. Streetlights flicked on one by one, just like the night I sat in my car, staring at my house for the first time, realizing the truth. I turned back, didn't answer. I walked to the office door, opened it, then closed it again, without saying a word. The lawyer understood. He nodded and gathered his files. No one brought it up again. The last time I heard Lorraine's name was on the evening news that night. Just a brief line. No footage, no interviews, just a notice that an individual connected to the poisoning case is currently being sought for questioning. I turned off the TV. The living room fell quiet. Eli was doing homework at the dining table. Naomi was washing dishes in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds filled the space, gentle and real. I sat down and closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt a door closing behind me and another path opening ahead. But I knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't completely over, and my silence now was the beginning of whatever came next. A year passed, quietly, like water receding from a riverbed after a flood. No noise, no fanfare, just waking up each morning and realizing I was still here, in a freshly painted house, in the smell of new coffee, in the sound of birds settling in the trees by the porch. Time doesn't erase everything, but it smooths the sharpest edges so a person can touch memory without bleeding. My body fully recovered, in a way I never dared believe in those early days. The first physical therapy sessions left me exhausted, but every steadier step was a silent affirmation that I'd reclaimed ownership of my body. Sam kept a close watch, no longer just doctor and patient, but two men who'd walked through a dangerous bend together. He smiled when he saw me lift a heavy box, then shook his head and warned me not to get overconfident. I listened, not out of fear, but because I'd learned to respect my own pace. Eli changed the most. Not in the way adults usually think, but in the way a child is returned to where he belongs. The nighttime jolts grew less frequent, then disappeared. He began sleeping deeply, dreaming dreams that, when he woke up, he told me about excitedly. Imaginary adventures spilling out of him. I took him back to the baseball field, sat on the old wooden bleachers, listened to the sharp crack of ball against bat echo in the afternoon sun. He ran, fell, laughed, got back up, and ran again. I watched him, my heart growing lighter little by little, as if with every step he took, another old fear was being left behind. Once, Eli asked me, very seriously, whether everything was truly over. I didn't answer right away. I ruffled his hair and looked down the street in front of the house. "Oh, some things don't end," I said. "They just stop controlling us." He nodded as if he understood more than I expected. Then he ran off, leaving me with a deep gratitude for the normalcy I had once taken for granted. Naomi grew up in a different way, no longer the kind of maturity forced by crisis, but the steadiness that comes from having stood firm while everything collapsed. She moved to live closer to me, not out of obligation, but by choice. We talked more, not about the past, but about the present and what could still be built. Some evenings, the two of us sat in the kitchen under warm yellow light, talking only about small, ordinary things. In her eyes, I no longer saw constant worry, but a quiet confidence. Our family was restructured, not through grand declarations, but through new routines. Dinner on time, planned weekends, slow Saturday mornings where no one rushed. No more secrets, no more half-told stories left hanging in the air. I didn't hide the past, but I didn't let it sit at the dinner table with us either. It stayed there, in memory, acknowledged and set in its proper place. Around the middle of the year, I made a decision many people thought was too early. I called Naomi into my office, the room that had once been the center of so much trouble. Now it looked completely different, brighter, tidier. I placed a folder in front of her, not thick, not showy. "I want you to run things," I said simply. Naomi looked at me, surprised, then frowned. "What are you saying?" "Everything," I replied. "The work, the decisions, the direction." She stayed silent for a long time. I didn't rush her. I had learned that important decisions need room to breathe. When Naomi finally looked up, what I saw in her eyes wasn't ambition, but responsibility. "Are you sure?" she asked. I nodded. Not the nod of a tired man wanting to let go, but the nod of someone who trusts. There was no applause in that moment, no witnesses other than the two of us. But for me, it was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Not because power was being handed over, but because I knew I had raised someone who could hold it without letting it twist her. After that day, I stepped back. I didn't disappear, I just stopped standing on the front line. I watched Naomi work, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just listening. She made mistakes, then corrected them. She made decisions I'd never even considered, and I smiled, realizing that the next generation doesn't need to resemble the previous one to do things right. At home, everything became comfortably clear. If something was hard to say, we said it. If there was fear, we acknowledged it. I no longer had to guess at people's intentions through their eyes or tone of voice. Honesty became the new foundation, stronger than any promise. As for me, I began preparing for the final chapter of my life, not with a sense of ending, but with the intention of someone who knows what he wants. I cleared out things I no longer needed, gave away items that had finished serving their purpose. I wrote a few notes, not a will, but messages for Eli to read when he's older. I don't want him to know me only through dramatic stories. I want him to remember me through peaceful afternoons, through the way I tied his shoelaces, through the times I sat and listened while he rambled on without a beginning or an end. Some evenings, when the house had gone to sleep, I sat alone on the porch. Not to think about Lorraine or Victor. Those names are now just distant markers. I thought about how many versions of myself I'd lived through to get here. The mechanic living simply, the man who faked his own death to protect his child, the father who stood up in his own house, and now an older man, still clear-headed enough to choose how to live the rest of his life. I don't know what the future will bring. No one does, but I know I no longer live in fear, no longer whisper to the darkness. I live in enough light, where things aren't perfect, but they're real. And for me, that's enough. The storm passed. What remained wasn't rubble, but ground that had been leveled, ready for the next steps. And this time, I walked not to escape, but to savor each step, slowly and deliberately, in the life I reclaimed through silence and resolve. The trial ended on a clear morning, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the courtroom and falling across the wooden benches where I sat quietly in the back. I didn't need to stand and speak. I didn't need to look at Victor again to know his fate. When the judge read the sentence, his voice even and clear, everything closed in the way I'd hoped most, without noise, without drama, just justice arriving where it belonged. Victor received a prison sentence long enough for him to understand that some boundaries cannot be crossed, no matter how much money, aggression, or cheap schemes you bring with you. When he was led away, he didn't look back at me. Maybe he understood that such a look no longer mattered. I didn't look after him either. I'd spent too much of my life staring at things that didn't deserve my attention. In that moment, I thought only of Eli, of Naomi, and of the fact that the darkest door had finally closed. Lorraine didn't have such a clear ending in a courtroom. She vanished from my life in the quietest way possible. No calls, no messages, no explanations or apologies. Some people said she moved to another state. Others said she went abroad, changed her name, started over. I didn't confirm anything. To me, her disappearance wasn't an escape. It was a complete ending. Some relationships don't need an exclamation point to finish. They end simply by no longer appearing. I kept no mementos connected to Lorraine. Not out of resentment, but because I didn't want to carry things that no longer belonged to my present life. The house was rearranged. No corner stirred memories of those false days. The space felt lighter, as if even the walls could breathe. Eli remained my greatest concern after everything. I set up a separate education fund for him, not to create pressure or unrealistic expectations, but to give him a long-term sense of safety. I told Eli it wasn't a reward or compensation, but a promise, that no matter how life shifted, his education and future would never be used as leverage in adult schemes. He listened very seriously, then asked a simple question. "Are you here, Dad?" I told him I was here. Not in bank accounts, not in paperwork, but in driving him to school every morning, reading with him every night, sitting on the sidelines, watching him play sports on the weekends. Eli smiled, and I knew that for him, the answer was enough. I withdrew from the things that once made my life complicated. No more unnecessary social obligations. No more calls where I had to wonder what the person on the other end really wanted. I slowed down, not because I was old, but because I'd learned the value of peace. Each day was no longer a battle, but a string of small, ordinary, genuine moments. Family, to me, was redefined as well. No longer people who share blood but remain strangers at heart. Family is who stays when everything collapses, who holds your hand when you can't stand, relationships built on respect and honesty. Naomi, Eli, and the friends who quietly helped me through the hardest time. That is my family now. I learned many things from everything that happened. That intuition isn't something to ignore, especially when it repeats itself in silence. That boundaries aren't selfish. They're how you protect yourself and the people you love. And that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the necessary preparation to stand up at the right moment. I also want to make one thing clear, not just for myself, but for anyone listening to this story. What you've just heard is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, created to offer moral value, life lessons, and emotional resonance. It does not promote violence, revenge, or extreme actions. Real life is far more complex, and every decision carries its own consequences. If you or someone close to you is in a difficult situation, being manipulated, emotionally or financially abused, the most important thing is to seek real-world help. Talk to someone you trust. Reach out to professionals, lawyers, or community support organizations. Don't try to carry everything alone in silence because no one deserves to live in fear or be stripped of their right to safety. And if you're listening to this story simply to pause for yourself, I hope you can take something from it, even something small. Maybe the courage to ask questions, maybe the clarity to listen to what you feel inside, or simply the reminder that you are not alone. If you're still listening at this point, let me know where you're listening from. A familiar city, or somewhere very far away. Every comment is a way for this story to keep living, to keep reaching others. If the story made you think, please tap like so it can spread further. And if you'd like to keep walking alongside stories that offer value, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for staying until the very end. Thank you for listening, not just to my story, but perhaps to something within yourself. For me, telling this journey isn't about closing the past, but about opening a different way of living. Slower, more honest, and no longer afraid.